Doctors of Reddit. What patient made you go, how the f are you even alive? Story 1. I thought I would mention a man I once treated as a patient many years ago when I worked in a small town by the sea. I'll call him Mr. M. Mr. M was a small town solicitor. There are not so many of them left in the UK now, but Mr. M and a couple of partners worked in a small solicitor's office, doing the usual round of wills, conveyancing, small-time disputes between neighbors, and so on. Mr. M was middle-aged, very overweight, suffered from high blood pressure and diabetes, and was not a very active man. He was married, and Mrs. M was his opposite, thin, anxious, and a bit overactive. They had a childless, rather unhappy marriage, for reasons not relevant to Mr. M's story. I knew Mr. M's health problems had him marked for an early grave, and that if we could get his weight down, his blood pressure and diabetes, neither of which were well controlled despite everyone's best efforts, would improve. Naturally, I spent a lot of time trying to deal with this issue with the usual round of advice, referrals to the dietitian, diet sheets, regular weight monitoring sessions, etc. Nothing made any difference at all, despite Mr. M continuing to sadly tell me how hard he was trying and how carefully he stuck to his diet. One day I think my frustration started to show. Mr. M seemed rather sadder than usual. I took a new tack and asked him, very sternly, to take me through what he did and ate on a typical day. We chose the day before. Slowly and reluctantly, this was his story. When he got up in the morning, he would go downstairs for breakfast, made for him by his wife. Breakfast would be 2 rashers of bacon, 2 sausages, 2 fried eggs, a fried tomato, and a slice of fried bread. This he would follow with 2 slices of toast and marmalade, and coffee with cream. Arriving at work, he would have a cup of coffee and 2 or 3 biscuits. After a couple of hours of work, he would walk down to the local baker's to buy a cake or donut for a mid-morning snack. Sometimes, he said, he would be hungry enough to buy 2 cakes or donuts. Around 12:30, exhausted and hungry, he and his partner would walk over to the local pub, where he would drink 2 pints of beer and have lunch. He quite liked the pub's pie and chips, but sometimes he would have steak and chips instead. He would usually follow this with something like apple pie and custard or chocolate fudge cake with cream. In the afternoon, his snack was usually only a couple of chocolate biscuits. This was all bad enough, but then he told me that on the way home, this would be between 5 and 6 in the evening, he would stop at the local fish and chip shop for a meal of fish and chips with mushy peas. When he got home, his wife would cook him dinner. Usually this was some sort of roast, perhaps roast beef with roast potatoes, veg, gravy, and Yorkshire pudding, followed by a dessert, perhaps apple pie or maybe trifle. Oh yeah, and they always had a bottle of wine between them. After his wife went to bed, he liked to sit up and watch a film on the TV, accompanied by a liter of Coca-Cola, not diet, of course, and a family bag of some snack or other, or a packet of chocolate biscuits. He took no exercise at all. Remember, this was back in the 1980s. This revocation absolutely stunned me. No wonder this chap's health problems could not be controlled. After I left the area, having made no headway on his problems, I used to run back from time to time to visit, and occasionally would see him around town, usually in the baker's. How he continued to stay alive remained a mystery to me. Story 2. Belligerent guy comes in a wheelchair. He doesn't want to be here, is freaking fine, and the party was good. Emergency Medical Services, or EMS, screwed his evening up. EMS brought him in from a bush party. The guy had a chainsaw stuck in his thigh and shin, literally jammed in his leg, and severe burns after falling into the bonfire on half his body. Guy was hammered, and didn't seem bothered by the fact that he was severely burned or had a chainsaw in his leg. He ended up losing the leg below his knee and got a nasty infection from the burn. But still, if his leg wasn't completely messed up, I'm convinced he'd have gotten up and tried to fight people. Story 3. I was in a home call for emergency room, ER in a small town. Got a call from the ER nurse one night and she was like, "Emergency Medical Services brought someone in here and they think she might be dead." I was like, "Well, is she?" She was like, "I don't know." This was a seasoned registered nurse, by the way, so I was like, well, I guess we're treating this as a code blue kind of situation. So without any further information, I jump into my car and rush over to the hospital. Once I got there, I realized why the triage nurse was so confused. In the trauma bay lay what appeared to be skeletonized remains under a blanket. The person felt warm to touch, so I opened their eye and a yellow, wrinkled, shrunken eyeball stared at me and then suddenly moved. Potassium of 1 for those familiar with lab values. The backstory was extreme self-neglect and depression combined with a caregiver neglect. Weighed in at 67 pounds at a height of about 5'5". We actually resuscitated her, very aggressively, and unbelievably after about 8 liters of fluid, she started speaking a word or 2 at a time and recognized her daughter. Story 4. My father's doctor couldn't believe, A, he didn't need to amputate his feet, and B, he was still alive. Dad had brittle diabetes. His pancreas would kick in and out due to a congenital deformity. At 82, he had significant heart issues, including angina, enlarged heart, and clogged arteries. One day, his feet went black, not just bluish or gray, black as charcoal. Rushed to emergency. We were told they would amputate, but to say our goodbyes. Dad refused surgery, said he'd rather be dead at his age. Hours later, his feet were pink. We took him home that morning. The doctor actually apologized for upsetting us, but said he'd never seen anything like it. Wow, the dude just straight up refused to die, and his body was like, all right, geez, you win. Story 5. Patient here. When I was 2, I was being treated for asthma due to wheezing, labored breathing, etc. One night it got exceptionally bad, so my mom took me to the ER. They put me face down to do a CT scan. This was 1990, and when they were done, they turned me back over and I was blue. Had stopped breathing. CT revealed a volleyball-sized mass in my chest. Emergency surgery revealed what was supposed to be my twin. Kept growing inside my ribcage and finally had nowhere to go in my toddler body, so it cut off my airway. It had fingernails, hair, appendages, everything but major organs. I made a full recovery. I am a healthy 31-year-old now, zero asthma. The only remnant of that night is a scar that goes from the center of my chest to the center of my back. Story 6. Currently in residency, but this was a patient I saw in medical school. This one has more to do with a patient's past medical history instead of anything acute. I had one patient in one of my internal medicine rotations who was admitted for hip surgery and was one of the nicest, sweetest people I've ever met. Her surgery was pretty routine and there were no complications. In her past medical history, she was diagnosed with stage 4 endometrial cancer that had spread to her brain. Apparently, she had undergone chemo, radiation, primary tumor resection, and surgery to remove the brain met. She remained cancer-free since that period. The fact that she had undergone that whole ordeal and appeared to be mostly healthy and in remission from her cancer really blew my mind. Story 7. During residency, my intensive care unit, ICU patient, had to have his chest reopened less than an hour after a 6-hour open heart coronary artery bypass graft, CABG surgery. He needed 12 units of blood, his heart massaged, then shocked 4 times. Cardiothoracic surgeons in the ICU operating because no time to go back down to the operating room. Was an illicit drug abuser and alcoholic. Nurses called him the cockroach. I checked in on him for 4 weeks. He was unresponsive every day. On week 20, we had to consult ear, nose, and throat to take maggots out of his nose. I was sure he was a goner after that. Week 3 passed, no change. Week 4, day 24, I believe. At 6 a.m., he opens his eyes. I was shocked. He has a permanent track and ostomy now, but somehow is alive. Story 8. I had a patient who was literally cut in half at the pelvis after a car hit him and pinned him to a telephone pole. Paramedics carried his legs in separately. He was wide awake and talking to me as we quickly put in a central line and he got all the bleeders ligated by 5 different surgeons. He declined pain meds repeatedly. What a legend. He was in the OR 5 minutes later. Luckily, this was at a major academic center with an exceptional trauma surgery team. Apparently, the guy lived. Not sure what his quality of life was after, but pretty crazy. Story 9. A couple of pictures of me before and after brain surgeries were on the front page around this time last year. The mortality rate for acute subdural hematomas is 50 to 90%. Of those who live, approximately 20 to 30% regain any brain functioning. Due to the subdural hematoma, the bleeding in my skull was so severe that I also had cranial herniation. My brain tilted 5 millimeters, causing my brainstem to compress into my spinal cord. That I not only lived but woke up and recovered well enough to go back to work and get married, travel the world, return to baseline physically is a straight-up medical miracle. I'm still in touch with a neurosurgeon who was on call at the hospital that day, and he says the same thing. Story 10. Lady in her mid-30s was in the clinic for a 1-week follow-up post-foot amputation, diabetes. She was admitted straight from the clinic because her blood glucose was 600 milligrams per deciliter, normal is 80 to 120, and the wound was severely infected. We used super concentrated doses of insulin to bring it back to the 200s. She was on strict diet restrictions and we couldn't figure out how it wouldn't drop any lower than 250. Turns out her kids, teens, had been sneaking giant 64-ounce sodas and candy bars into the hospital, literally 1 week after we chopped her foot off because of uncontrolled diabetes. Not exactly a case of how the hell did you survive that trauma or disease, but how the hell do you even function on your own? Story 11. I work in trauma and once had a guy fall off a roof and he said he remembered hitting the bars and the scaffolding on the way down. We originally thought he'd fractured his femur, but nope, just a small hematoma. He was in bed next to a man who had broken his ribs and had a small C-spine fracture when he fell forward picking up his keys. Story 12. Not a doctor, but I had a few doctors ask me that. Typically, if you get appendicitis, it'll rupture and sepsis will set in within a day or so. And when that happens, it gets really bad really fast. So I got appendicitis, it freaking hurt so bad, but I didn't know I had appendicitis. I went to the doctor, he couldn't tell what was going on. He thought I had compacted stool and wanted me to take stool softeners. So I did, but it didn't help. 'Cause spoiler, it was appendicitis, right? And then a roommate who thinks he knows what he's talking about tells me that it's all in my head and I just need to physically get off the couch and exercise because he feels much better after he exercises. Okay, dude, I can't even get off the couch to use the restroom without almost passing out in pain. He tells me to just play a video game to get my mind off it. I go to class, grad student at the time. I call the doctor and make another appointment. He doesn't know what's going on. I talk with another doctor, no clue. He thought maybe it was appendicitis, but I didn't have a fever and didn't have a recoil pain. So maybe it was gastrointestinal stuff. So I schedule an appointment to meet with him. All the while, I'm going to class and taking the maximum dosage of all pain relievers I can get my hands on. And finally, the gastrointestinal doctor's scans show that I had appendicitis. Hooray! I go to the nearest ER and I say, in a totally calm tone, "Hi, my name is," insert name here. So my doctor said I should probably go to the ER because my appendix burst a while ago and it should probably be taken out or something. Turns out my appendix burst and I held onto it for 3.5 weeks. I had a dozen doctors come in and some of them even started by saying, "Hello, my name is Dr. Such and Such, and I heard that you were the guy who has had a burst appendix for nearly a month and you're still alive. I'm not in your case, but I just wanted to meet you. How the hell are you still alive? How the hell did you drive yourself here and just waltz into our ER?" I got that alien bioengineering upgrade where the abdomen moves around and wall seals off the burst appendix so it doesn't leak everywhere. After my primary care physician learned I had appendicitis and he didn't diagnose it, he retired within a month. It was probably coincidental. Story 13. As a med student on my emergency rotation, I had a guy brought in who had fallen off a 7th or 8th floor balcony and landed on his head. Essentially DOA, and we couldn't get blood pressure when he got to the hospital. As a student, my job was to basically stand to the side and squeeze the bajillion bags of blood that went into this dude. His cervical spine was essentially dust in the initial CT scan we got. I figured he probably wouldn't have made it, but about a month later, I'm now on my ICU rotation, and I see this guy awake and conscious. Pretty crazy. Story 14. We had a guy with a major aortic dissection one night. From the bedside ultrasound, he looked like he had already bled out. He had some chest pain, but he was alert and oriented, and we were shocked he was even still alive. He absolutely shouldn't have been with how much blood we saw and the size of the dissection. We called the surgeon in, who was really blunt and explained to the guy he was probably going to die in surgery. He was a young guy, in his late 40s. He was on a business trip and it was completely unexpected. He kept trying to call his wife, but it was like 2 a.m. and she wasn't answering. He just wanted to talk and tell her goodbye. It was actually pretty devastating to watch. Meanwhile, he's so coherent and alert as if he isn't actively bleeding out and dying. Most patients we would get in the same situation wouldn't be conscious or would already be dead. They swooped him off to surgery before he could contact his wife, and the dude lived. Remembering that story got me through a lot of tough years in the ER because I think it just reminded me that hope and good outcomes are still out there. The late 40s is young for this kind of case to happen. We usually see people dissect in their 70s to 90s. Also, the late 40s is a pretty young age to die, especially if you don't have any chronic illnesses. A couple of weeks ago, my emergency department lost a 30-year-old to COVID-19. A couple of nurses cried because we consider people twice his age still pretty young. This happened when I was still tech and had only been in the ER for about a year. He was brought in by EMS and comfortable, but definitely awake and alert. His electrocardiogram was normal and he didn't have any pertinent history, just chronic hypertension and a few minor surgeries. But he was hypotensive and really pale, and when we performed the ultrasound, we found what looked like a huge volume of blood in the abdomen and a visible intimal tear. We pretty much immediately diagnosed him with aortic dissection and had vascular surgery in the room within a few minutes. I followed up on his chart a few days later and found not only that he was alive, but he was already extubated and able to walk. Story 15. When my mom was in her ER cycle during her internship, a man with police officers behind him came into the ER. The man was perfectly fine and walking, so my mom and her colleagues were confused. The officer showed them a picture of a crumpled metal piece, which was a car. It didn't look like a car at all, just metal trash. The officers told my mom and her colleagues that they rescued the patient from the car, which was lit on fire only a few seconds after they rescued him. The patient didn't have a single scar on him, was perfectly fine and got his name around the hospital for being immortal. Story 16. My dad is 87. He has prostate, liver, bowel, colon, and skin cancer. For the skin cancer, he had lots of reconstructive surgeries. his whole tibia region and the back of his hands. Every year he has to have at least one skin lesion removed. He had a couple of heart attacks and then a sextuple bypass surgery. He also had a big pneumonia, a huge abscess, and a small stroke. His doctor wants to see him every 6 months. I think just to be amazed that he's still walking around. Story 17. We had one of these at an eye doctor's office of all places. The patient was complaining about how her new glasses weren't working, so the doctor took her in back to check to see if the prescription needed tweaking. The doctor came up with a completely different prescription. The patient was overweight but claimed she was not diabetic. The doctor convinced her to let us take a blood sugar measurement with a staff member's personal glucose meter. All the meter displayed was high. With some arguing, we were able to get her to the local hospital right away. I don't remember what her blood sugar level was, but I remember it was the hospital's high score for a while. She should not have been conscious, let alone functioning normally. Story 18. A guy, now passed away, had incurable lung cancer from Agent Orange exposure during infantry service in Vietnam, and his wife had recently died. Cancer, wife died. The guy was pretty positive, glass half full about chemo considering the double whammy. Asked him how he managed to keep it positive. He said he was returning to base with just days left in his enlistment. The rookie pilot has a mechanical failure of some sort in their UE. They're going down and not the controlled kind of landing either. He assumes he's about to die. Says everything got real slow, real bright, and a sense of acceptance and peace washed over him. The rookie pulls one out at the last moment and lands the bird with no casualties. The patient told me he felt he should have died that day, and every single day since was a complete gift. Maybe being alive has a lot to do with attitude. Story 19. Obligatory, not a doctor. I'm a funeral director and I received the body of a 90-something man. I could tell he had been sick for quite some time just by looking at his face. Another funeral director did the embalming, so I hadn't seen the rest of his body. Seeing that he was so old and just looked sick, I was surprised when I met his daughter and she inquired about an autopsy. I asked my usual questions and discovered that this man, for 40+ years, had unregulated diabetes. He was shot in 3 different occasions in his life. He had a history of strokes, bed sores, deep ones, in and out of the hospital for sepsis and pneumonia, heavy smoker, heavier drinker, suffered a major heart attack just days before. His vision was going and he couldn't keep himself awake, horrible jaundice, cirrhosis, had an infected kidney removed, on and on. I don't think this man lived one healthy day in the last 20 years. They asked the daughter, "So you want an autopsy because..." She tells me that her father was not an ill man and it was not his time to go. She's furious I even questioned her request. I'm baffled that this man lived for 90+ years. The denial people can experience in hand with grief is astounding. Story 20. 2 patients that give me faith in what medicine can do when I think about it, both quite young to be so sick. First was a woman who was very pregnant and some genius doc agreed to put her under twilight anesthesia for an elective procedure that definitely could have waited. Went into labor while she was under and from there had everything go wrong and ended up in cardiac arrest. Was transported to my hospital and put on extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. She was in rough shape when I saw her first. Most people in her condition don't make it. I ended up seeing her a month later walking to my outpatient apartment clinic and I got the creepiest feeling. It was like seeing a ghost. She was fine. Not like most people who come out of the ICU after that kind of stay. The second was a young guy who bled out in the ICU of a sudden hemorrhage. He was pulseless for about an hour. Without going into a bunch of details, he required several procedures after that, which were risky on their own. It took weeks for him to reboot, but eventually he was responding to stimuli. After a couple of months, he walked out of the hospital. He wasn't dying, he was dead for an hour. That these 2 survived is a testament to modern medical science. That they walked out of the hospital on their own, needing little to no assistance, and with their cognition completely intact is a miracle. I remembered another one that was pretty wild. This guy had very advanced cancer which had invaded the major blood vessels of his abdomen and chest. When they took him to surgery, his vena cava was involved and it sounds like it just unraveled. They were not ready for a major cardiothoracic procedure, so they were just dumping blood products into him to keep him alive, while they could get someone to repair this major vessel. I thought the op report had a typo because they said the estimated blood loss was 30 liters. I forget the breakdown, but they had put hundreds of units of blood, liters and liters of crystalloids and plasma. It's about 6 times of the blood in a normal person. He was white as a sheet for weeks after this, but he made it. Story 21. Patient here. When I was 7, I had horrible asthma. My mom often lay in my bed with me and listened to my breathing. One night she fell asleep and jerked away in the wee hours of the night, and found I was not breathing. Goes to the ER immediately because it was only like 10 minutes away. Not sure what happened while there or what tests they did, but I was declared dead. In the morning I woke up and asked who I believe was a nurse where I was, and she started crying and called in my mother, who hadn't slept all night. The doctors said they didn't know how the hell I was still alive. Now 16 and haven't had any hospital-worthy complications since. God damn it. My mom is the most amazing and loving person on this green earth. Your mom probably never slept again. Holy crap.